Hi friends, it's Grace and welcome back to another video. Today I'm going to be talking about where to begin with fantasy. And this is honestly a little bit of a difficult video to make. There is obviously not going to be any one-size-fits-all answer to this question because not only does everybody have different tastes, but everyone is at a different spot in their reading journey as well. So I don't think that there's anything like better or worse about enjoying more or less complex fantasy series, but I kind of just wanted to make a list of things that I think could be good entry points depending on who you are as a reader, and I want to explain like why I've chosen each one. And I'm actually I am and am not going to include arguably the most popular and most recommended series for this. I'm going to acknowledge it, but that is Mistborn Era 1 by Brandon Sanderson. Is like, not that I don't think that it could be a good entry point into fantasy, because I do, but I also feel like it's kind of recommended into the ground as an entry point into fantasy, and I just think that there should be some alternatives. Like I wanted to present some other options and explain why, explain what the books are about and explain why I think they could be good entry points. And maybe like if someone watching this thinks like, hey, this one sounds good for me particularly, then maybe it could be a great answer for you. So that is my goal with this list. Also, this is by no means an exhaustive list. There are definitely other things on my shelves that I looked at and debated including, but I tried to pare it down a little bit so that this video isn't ridiculously long. And if you watch this and you are looking for like some other recommendation or even a more like intermediate recommendation, you can definitely drop a comment and like ask me, and I will do my best to recommend you something if I think of something that fits the bill that I've read. So first up, and one of my personal favorite series, is the Winter Trilogy by Catherine Arden, and the first book in this series is The Bear and the Nightingale. Not only does this series have gorgeous hardcovers, it also has gorgeous vibes. So basically in this series, we are dealing with our main character, Vasya, who lives in this isolated, very, very wintry forest town in Russia, but old Russia. This is very much like a Slavic folklore fairy tale type of vibe, and our main character, Vasya, is dealing with the fact that she has a stepmother who does not respect the old household gods and spirits that most people in the town leave offerings to and still keep to. And this kind of leads to misfortunes befalling the town and dangerous things coming closer because these old household spirits are not being respected, and this is very bad for the equilibrium of old magic. And this book, the reason why I think that this is a great introduction and beginner fantasy series is because, first of all, it is a trilogy. It is not a huge commitment in terms of number of books, and it's also not a huge commitment in terms of number of pages. So this is not a super long book. This is about 400 pages, and I believe that the third book in the series might get up to 500 pages. I don't remember for sure, but none of these books are dense in terms of writing style. They are very readable and they are not super long. So that is one main selling point for this series. I also think that if you have an interest in history or mythology or folklore and you don't necessarily have experience in straight up high fantasy, this can be a great blend of some of those things, because you certainly have some semblance of a magic system in here, but it's a lot softer and it does focus a lot more on folklore, and it feels like a fairy tale, and it's very atmospheric. It's easy to sink into this. It's also a great read for this season, for the winter, so if you want to pick this up, you might just feel like it's the perfectly appropriate read. And it also has a main character that's just really easy to root for. I think that there are some really unique things done with Farseer's story, but it also kind of starts out with some classic tropes of, well, you have a bit of a rebellious younger main character who doesn't want to either be married or be confined in a convent for the rest of her life. She wants to break out and decide what she is going to do with her life and how she's going to live it. It's a little bit of a classic storyline, and it is very, very easy to follow and to get into, in my opinion. So with that, like, combined with the pretty transparent prose style, like it's very much just in the background doing the heavy lifting while being easy to read, and the short length of the series, I think that this is a really, really good sort of like entry point if you want to get into a series. Next up, we have a cozy fantasy that is one of the most popular and talked about books of the past year, without a doubt, and that is Legends and Lattes by Travis Baldree. So this is definitely like a secondary world fantasy setting, but it's also combined with the fact that it's a very, very small scale, cozy, character-driven storyline and actual plot. So while you get like a tiny, tiny taste of the fact that this is a different world with like different races and different creatures like non-humans, you don't have to deal with that information on top of a bunch of other things being piled onto you. This is just a very like sweet, romantic, friendship building story that just happens to be set in a different world. So I think that it can be like a really interesting taste test to see, no pun intended since it's about like coffee and baked goods, but to see whether you might be interested in reading something that's set in a secondary world, where this is like, it's not exactly like just a regular romance novel, of course, because there is magic in this world, there is different rules, but it is very like easy to follow, and the characters are lovable and easy to root for. And so it is very much fun to read, I guess, and easy to read. And it is just kind of like, it has a lot of joy and a lot of optimism and hope. And so I think that this is just a very happy book that could do a good job of telling you whether you're interested in diving into some of the other aspects that are present here in like a different fantasy series. Okay, next up is a book that I do technically have a physical copy of, but it's part of a massive like illustrated bind up of the whole series, so I am not holding that thing up for the video, and that is A Wizard of Earthsea by Ursula K. Le Guin, and I've actually only read the first of this series, but I think that it is a perfect, like, it's not exactly YA, it definitely falls, in my opinion, somewhere between YA and adult, but it does kind of read like YA in the sense that it has some darker content and some like life type lessons that could read a little bit older, but it also has this sort of coming of age story and this school setting that are maybe reminiscent of things that people are familiar with already, and the magic system is really, really cool while not being too, I guess, beyond comprehension. Like it's not overly complex, and in the places where it is, you aren't supposed to be trying to understand it. It is very much like something that will be explained to you later. And I think that it is, first of all, Ursula K. Le Guin is an amazing writer and deserves some like recognition, I think, outside of the fantasy community for the work that she was doing in classic fantasy decades ago. But I think that one of the impressive things about this is how easily and smoothly it reads. I think that some other classic fantasy can be a little bit bogged down with some of the like tropes and I don't know, conventions of the time. And sometimes you roll your eyes at some of the things that can be happening in like really, really old fantasy books. But Le Guin is just so masterful of a writer. Like, she manages to write about this wizard who is the like titular character, and his coming of age and his discovery of the joys and dangers of magic. And there are just so many cool things. It's quite a short book as well, and I think that it is a great, for a similar reason to Legends and Lattes, it might give you an idea of whether you might be interested in seeing some of these classical tropes or ideas written in like longer and more political or complex series. And if you do think that you would like them, it'd be a great test for that. Now, the next entry on this list is once again one of my favorite fantasy series of all time, and this one is a little bit longer when you look at overall page count. However, it is still a trilogy, and part of my reasoning for including this on the list is that just because you are a beginner with fantasy does not mean that you're a beginner with reading. Like, you can be a very experienced reader, obviously, who just hasn't veered into the sphere of fantasy and isn't sure whether you would want to and whether you'd like it. And I think that this can appeal to someone who fits that bill, but it also has a wide appeal because of the fact that it reads like The Godfather in a fantasy world. And that, which people probably know what I'm talking about after I said that anyway, is the Greenbone Saga by Fonda Lee, and the first book of that series is Jade City. So we have Jade City being the first book, and then it continues with Jade War and Jade Legacy. So like I said, this is a trilogy, so not a huge number of books. And this, like I said also though, is a little bit longer in terms of page count. So Jade City is 400 and something, like, okay, this is just under 500 pages, which I understand is a little bit chunky for some. However, it does read very smoothly. And the final book in the trilogy, I believe, is around 700. So this is maybe a little bit more of an intermediate series in terms of length. However, I do believe that in terms of readability and in terms of like a wide appeal of the content, this absolutely has that. So Jade City follows two clans, the No Peak clan and the Mountain clan, and we are following a family, the Call family, that makes up one of the clans. And these clans have a massive rivalry in the city of Yanloon, and they are comprised of jade warriors that can wear the actual gemstone, like jade or mineral or whatever you actually call it, and that can imbue these people with some magic abilities and like fighting skills and like enhanced strength, speed, that type of thing. And this is very much like an industry. These people who can wear jade are the only people who can actually use it in this manner. People who don't have jade abilities can get like jade sickness and things like that if they try and use it. And so this is a very interesting portrait of characters that are not necessarily likable or even sympathetic, but Fonda Lee does such a phenomenal job of getting you to be on their side because you get to see them in such a personal way. And I think that this like avenue of morally gray characters and people who are flawed and who make questionable decisions could be applicable, or not applicable, but like appealing to a general fiction reader if you love reading books about people who are kind of disasters. There's some of that in here. If you like reading about like crime or anything, I think that this has plenty of that. There is just a very, like, I could see this being adapted into a movie series. Like, I think that would be fantastic. It has some great action, but it also has such great, like, slower moments with the characters to really get you invested. And Yeah, I don't know. Like I said, I just think that the content in here has a really wide appeal for people who like movies. I don't know, but it makes sense in my head. Also, if you like to be emotionally destroyed by a book or a series, that's also a reason to recommend this. So like I said earlier, the reason that I think this is a good beginner series is because it is a trilogy and because of the actual writing style. Fonda Lee is a great writer, but she's also very readable. This is like a book that if you're invested in it, I believe that you can fly through it. And I think you will be, personally, because these books will destroy you. Okay, next up we have a book that is sort of a standalone or a series, choose your own adventure depending on which one you want it to be, and that is one reason that I think that this is a great entry point, because it's the type of book where if you want more, there is another book following different characters in this same world. However, if you don't want it to be that, you can just read this as a standalone. So that is Kings of the Wild by Nicholas Eames. And this book follows a sort of like washed up band of warriors who were absolutely like famous in their prime. They were the most like fearsome group of people and they are referred to as bands. And so this story kind of follows the idea of getting the band back together when all of these guys are older, and this is basically to go save our main character's daughter. Actually, sorry, it's not our main character, it's one of our main characters, but it is one of the other band members' daughters. And so his goal is to get the band back together so that he can go save his daughter, but they're all like not as strong as they used to be, not as ferocious as they used to be. They're kind of like old drunks that have gained a bit of weight, and like they're gonna get the band back together anyway and see what they can do about going to save her. And the reason that these are called bands is because this is chock full of like, I think it's 70s music references. I think that the other book is 80s music references. Otherwise, I would say that it's just music references, but I think it's specific. And so this is kind of like a really, really fun ride that I think a lot of people could enjoy. And if you like classic rock music, you'll also have the benefit of getting all of these references. And so all of the guys in this band are pretty fun and funny, and they also have some trauma. So like there is some character depth here. Like they look back on their past experiences and they have taken those into who they've become as human beings. But in terms of getting the band back together, this is very much like it has that wholesome found family vibe, and also overcoming some like friendship rifts that might have arisen while they were not together as a band. So it has a lot of like chaos. I rated this very highly. It did have one thing that bothered me that happened near the end, but I just think that because of the fast-pacedness and the fun-lovingness of this book, it's a really, really good entry point for somebody who like is a plot-driven reader, I guess, because I'm somebody who loves a slow-paced, character-driven book. And I know that a lot of other people like that too, especially probably literary fiction readers. But I also know that if you're the type of person who reads, say, like James Patterson, or like mystery thrillers, or like things that are basically action movies in book form, and you wanted to try out some fantasy, I think that this would be a great choice for you. Once again, one of the reasons that this is on the list is because it is not super long. It's less than 500 pages. I know that sounds long to like, I don't know, fantasy books tend to be longer than average, so that might sound long. However, it is an Orbit paperback. Orbit paperbacks look bigger. They have some bigger font. Like, this is not that many words on a page, I guess. I feel like this is a really easy read. Easy, fun, fantasy. So that's why it's on this list. Now, next up we have a staple of classic fantasy, and that is The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. And I personally do not believe that Lord of the Rings is introductory fantasy. I know that it is widely popular, especially the movies. However, I think that the big difference between The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings is the way that Tolkien actually writes it. I don't think that Tolkien's prose is necessarily for beginners in the sense that it can be pretty dry and dense. I know that some people won't like me saying that, but the fact of the matter is I felt like I was a decently experienced reader when I first read them, and I had some trouble like getting through some of the parts, even though I still think it's a great story. So for that reason, I think that The Hobbit is much more appropriate for someone who is a newcomer to fantasy, just because this is like a lot more, I don't know, just accessible in the way that he writes it. I think that The Hobbit was very much geared towards a younger audience, and I think that that's why you can tell such a difference between Tolkien's writing. And that's not to say that like it's lesser than because it was written for a younger audience. I actually think that it's a more enjoyable read for that reason. And so obviously people are familiar with The Hobbit just generally because like not only did they make Lord of the Rings movies, but they also made Hobbit movies. But I do think that this story about Bilbo setting out on his adventure like with all the dwarves and encountering the forest, the dragon, like etc. It's got so many classic fantasy things. Like, I'm not gonna say that this was the originator of them because I don't know that, but the fact that this was written in the 1930s obviously preceded a lot of fantasy. And if you are interested in seeing like whether you like these classic fantasy tropes, The Hobbit is definitely an easy and enjoyable way to get a taste of that. And so it's a great option in my opinion. I have a feeling this video is getting longer than I anticipated. However, we are almost to the end of the list. This next book is not, I don't know, it is fantasy, but it's also maybe not the type of fantasy that you would expect if you just think of fantasy in the general sense. It's almost like, it's more magical realism, but that is The Ocean at the End of the Lane by Neil Gaiman. This is the illustrated edition. It's absolutely gorgeous. This is one of my favorite books, and it's very short. I know it doesn't necessarily look that way, but that's because this is the illustrated edition. Like, there's a lot of pages here that have like, you know, 2 sentences with a bunch of gorgeous artwork. So this is a very, very short book, which I think is one of the reasons why I put it on this list in the first place. And I think that this has a very interesting niche appeal where it's kind of got this melancholy feeling to it. I wouldn't recommend it if you're looking for something like fun-loving. It's very unsettling. It's almost like a children's story, but like a children's horror story. This, like from the perspective of the character that we're following, is a terrifying experience, but it has that magical realism, that atmospheric vibe, and that like I said, melancholy to it that I think would appeal to a literary fiction reader who likes things that are more emotional and like hard-hitting. It's hard to say, but this has fantasy elements and like a very, very soft magic system and things that are not explained. So if that appeals to you, then I would look into this. And this also has, in a way, it's very grounded in the real world, and it's actually sad in the way that it is. And this, like, I find it cozy and comforting, which I know is a weird thing to say with the way that I've been describing it, but it just has those vibes to me. And because it's so short, I think that this is a great way to discover whether you would be a fan of more like serious and emotional fantasy that leans less on the plot and more on like introspection and character moments, and maybe a little bit more hard-hitting commentary on society. It's hard to describe this book, but I do love it. And I think that it can be a litmus test in that sense, aside from the fact that it's very short. So it's not too much of a commitment to decide if this is the type of thing that you could like. Now, speaking of being emotional and being a little bit heavier and hard-hitting, for this last entry on the list, I am going back to the fact that to be an inexperienced fantasy reader does not mean that you're an inexperienced reader. I think there are plenty of people who read like extremely chonky books that just happen to not be in the fantasy realm, or they enjoy the human side of the exploration of like literary fiction or classics, but they just haven't read fantasy. And for those people, I will give you like a kind of disclaimer that I'm not necessarily recommending all of Robin Hobb because those are a lot of books, but what I have put on this list is the Farseer Trilogy by Robin Hobb. This is the one of the 2 eligible starting points into her realm of the Elderlings, and like I said, I am not recommending just jumping into the entire realm of the Elderlings for a beginning fantasy reader. Unless you want to, then by all means be my guest. However, I feel like Robin Hobb's world in the Six Duchies, which is the world that the Farseer Trilogy takes place in, she has a relatively low magic story going on here. It starts out very much as a coming of age story, and it is definitely emotionally hard-hitting and character-driven. There is a relatively classic monarchy and kingdom system that you're exploring here, so you're not jumping into a secondary world where you have no idea what's going on in terms of the titles and positions people hold. It's relatively easy to figure out all of that stuff, and you're just following Fitz, who was a bastard of one of the princes, as he is claimed by the royal family and raised by them and in the castle, and where his life goes and his training to be an assassin, or at least to be an assassin's apprentice. The reason that I think that this could be a good option is that it does, Robin Hobb in general, you can lean into the more fantasy aspects of her, or you can appreciate her prose. She's a phenomenal writer, so that's where I think that the appeal comes in for the wider reading population, because you can just appreciate the actual craft of writing that she puts into these books, because that is phenomenal. Now I will say that this one is one of the longer trilogies because Assassin's Apprentice itself is not very long. However, Royal Assassin and Assassin's Quest do get quite a bit bigger, so that is something to keep in mind. It's not something that I would keep a secret while recommending this. You have to know at least how long this trilogy is. However, I do feel like if you, one of the reasons why this is on my recommendations list is because the first book is shorter. It's about 400 pages, and it's an easier way to describe or to decide if you like Robin Hobb's writing style. So that's kind of where I'm coming from on it. And if you're really on board with Assassin's Apprentice, even though the next couple of books are longer, you will know either way if you're kind of into it or not, if you're willing to put in the time and effort to read the longer sequel installments. Also, Royal Assassin is arguably way better than Assassin's Apprentice, in my opinion. So while I do think that the realm of the Elderlings as a whole is some of the best fantasy that I've ever read, in lieu of recommending that entire series, because it is of course very long, I at least wanted to put one of her trilogies on the list. And of the 2 eligible starting points, this one here, The Live Ship Traders, is a lot longer. It is phenomenal, don't get me wrong, but it's a lot longer. It has multiple points of view, whereas Farseer is a first-person perspective from Fitz. I think that it fits a lot better with the experiences of a reader who hasn't dipped their toes into fantasy, might be more in their comfort zone if they started with Farseer. So that is why I've included it on the list, and that is my final installment on the list. So I tried to go for a variety of reading levels of experience and standalones versus series, and for the most part pretty short things that are kind of not as much of a commitment for you to be able to tell whether you might be interested in fantasy or not. I hope I've succeeded in giving a range of options here with a range of appeals. Of course, I like all of them, so this is pretty dependent on my tastes just because that's what I have to draw from based on what I've read. But I really hope that this is a educational list that actually manages to provide some good options if you are interested in getting into fantasy. So with that said, that is it for this list and this video. Please like this video if you liked it. Like I said at the beginning of the video, if there's something that's not on here or you're looking for a slightly different or specific recommendation, you can definitely drop a comment and I will do my best to help you out. Or just comment and tell me what you thought of the list. As always, please do subscribe if you want to see more content from me. I post new videos on most Mondays and Thursdays, and I will have my socials, Discord with Ben, and Patreon linked in the description below if you're interested in any of that stuff. And I hope that you have a fantastic rest of your day. Bye!